They tried to erase me, not with a bullet or a blade, but with a whisper of code sent through the air. A command sent to a piece of technology buried deep beneath my skin, a so-called failsafe they had installed years ago. They called it a medical monitor, a way to track biometrics and ensure operational readiness. I called it a leash. Now, it had become an executioner's switch, a silent, invisible hand reaching into my own body to squeeze the life from it. The pain was unlike anything I had ever known, a white-hot fire that started at the base of my skull and spread down my spine, a biological system being told to simply stop. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat a frantic, desperate drum against the encroaching silence they had ordered. It was a contingency I had secretly planned for, a nightmare scenario I had prayed would never come to pass. In the filth of a back-alley washroom, surrounded by the stench of stale beer and desperation, I had to perform surgery on myself. My hands, slick with rain and my own sweat, trembled as I dug into the flesh of my neck with a crude, sterilized blade I kept for this exact purpose. The world narrowed to a pinpoint of agony. Every nerve screamed in protest. I could feel the microscopic device, no bigger than a grain of rice, humming with its malevolent instruction. Ripping it out felt like tearing a part of my own soul from my body, a brutal, bloody severing of the connection to my former life. The small, metallic object fell into the grimy sink with a synthetic clink. I stared at my reflection in the cracked, stained mirror. The man looking back was a stranger, his face pale and contorted in a mask of pain and raw fury. Blood trickled from the ragged wound on my neck, mixing with the cold sweat beating on my forehead. The sirens I heard were distant at first, a faint cry in the sprawling, indifferent city. But I knew they were for me. They had received the alert. The asset was offline. The package was compromised. They would be coming to collect, to finish the job their remote command had failed to complete. I knew then that Elias Crow was dead. The man who wore that name, the loyal soldier who followed orders and believed in the mission, had just been executed in a forgotten corner of Talon. What was left was something else entirely, a ghost born in a moment of excruciating betrayal. I pressed a wad of rough paper towel to the bleeding wound, the sting a sharp reminder that I was, for now, still alive. But survival was no longer the objective. Not anymore. Now, it was about vengeance. I had to run, to disappear, to become the phantom they had inadvertently created. I had to become a ghost in their machine. The rain fell in relentless sheets, turning the cobblestone streets of Talon's old town into slick black mirrors that reflected the neon glow of bars and the cold, watchful eyes of surveillance cameras. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist, morphing into the shape of a pursuer. Every distant footstep echoed like a gunshot in the narrow alleyways. My body screamed in protest, a symphony of pain from the fresh wound and the lingering electrical shock of the kill switch. But adrenaline was a powerful anesthetic, a fuel that burned through the agony and replaced it with a singular, primal focus: escape. I was a rat in a maze of their design, and I knew they were watching every exit. I moved through the labyrinth of the city, keeping to the darkness. I pulled the hood of my jacket low, obscuring my face from the thousands of digital eyes that lined the rooftops and doorways. They had my biometrics, my gait, the very rhythm of my heartbeat. To them, I was a collection of data points, a glowing red dot on a map in some sterile operations center miles away. I had to break the pattern, to become unpredictable noise in their clean signal. I deliberately altered my stride, forcing a limp. I hunched my shoulders, making myself smaller, less imposing. I was shedding the skin of Elias Crow, the confident operative, and cloaking myself in the anonymity of the desperate and the broken. The city that had once felt like a temporary home now felt like a cage closing in. The distant wail of sirens grew closer, then faded, then rose again from another direction. They were bracketing the area, a systematic tightening of the net. I ducked into a crowded late-night market, the air thick with the smell of grilled meats and damp wool. I moved through the throng of people, a ghost weaving through the living, using their bodies as a shield. I saw their faces, laughing, talking, oblivious to the invisible war being waged in their midst. For a moment, a bitter wave of envy washed over me. They had lives. I had a hunt. My training kicked in, overriding the panic and the pain. I saw the city not as streets and buildings, but as a series of tactical opportunities. A passing tram became a temporary block in a line of sight. A construction site offered a maze of scaffolding and shadows. A darkened park was a void on their thermal imaging. I was thinking like they would think, anticipating their moves, trying to stay one step ahead of the algorithms and the men who followed their instructions. I was no longer just running from them. I was actively hunting for a way out, a crack in the foundation of their perfect, all-seeing system. They had made me a target, but they had also made me their worst nightmare. My first priority was to become invisible, not just to the naked eye, but to the digital spectrum they commanded. I found a dimly lit hostel on the edge of the city's industrial district, the kind of place that asked no questions and remembered no faces, so long as you paid in cash. In a small, cold room that smelled of mildew and regret, I began the painful process of erasing myself. I took the worn leather wallet from my pocket, the last vestige of my official identity. Inside was a driver's license, credit cards, a military ID. All of it useless now, worse than useless, a tracking beacon. I snapped each card in half. The sharp crack echoed the severing of my past. The next to go was my phone, a military-grade encrypted device, supposedly secure. A lie. It was a listening post, a GPS marker, a direct line to their ear. I didn't just turn it off, I had to destroy it completely. I wrapped it in a towel to muffle the sound. I smashed it with the heel of my boot until the screen was a spider web and the internals were a mangled wreck. I removed the SIM card. I removed the memory chip and crushed them into powder. It felt like a ritual, a violent baptism into my new reality. Every piece of technology I carried was a potential betrayal. Then I looked at myself in the small, warped mirror above the sink. The face was too recognizable. The short, military-style haircut was a signature. The clean-shaven jaw belonged to a uniform I no longer wore. I found rusty scissors in the drawer and began hacking at my hair. Dark strands fell into the sink. The result was crude and uneven, but different. I left the stubble to grow, to soften the jaw. I was creating a new mask, neglect and anonymity. The man in the mirror was no one they'd be looking for. Finally, I shed my clothes. Tactical jacket, durable pants, combat boots. I left them in a pile. I put on a cheap, ill-fitting set from a street vendor, the last of my untraceable cash. A faded sweatshirt, worn jeans, soft-soled shoes. I was a blank slate, no name, no history, no digital footprint. I slipped out into the pre-dawn gloom. The man who had checked in was gone. I was taking my first steps as a dead man. The hunt had just begun. The first 24 hours were a frantic, calculated purge of a lifetime's digital accumulation. It wasn't just about the phone in my pocket or the cards in my wallet. It was about the ghost I had left behind in the machine, the breadcrumb trail of data that stretched back years. In the anonymous confines of an all-night internet cafe, smelling of stale coffee and burnt electronics, I began the delicate and dangerous work of dismantling my online self. I used a public terminal, routing my connection through a chain of proxies that bounced my signal across half the globe, a digital sleight of hand to mask my true location. I was a phantom reaching out from the void to systematically delete my own history, one keystroke at a time. My fingers flew across the sticky keyboard, accessing old email accounts, social media profiles I'd barely used, and cloud storage filled with mundane memories that now felt like liabilities. Each one was a potential anchor, a digital thread they could pull to find me. I didn't just delete the accounts. I had to corrupt them from the inside out, flooding them with junk data, changing passwords to nonsensical strings of characters, and altering personal information to point them in a dozen different false directions. Let them chase the ghost of a man who suddenly lived in Antarctica and worked as a theoretical physicist. Let their algorithms choke on the garbage I was feeding them. It was a small act of defiance, a way of fighting back in the only battleground I could access. The process was methodical, but it was also deeply unsettling. It felt like I was methodically burning old photographs and letters, incinerating the evidence of my own existence. A picture from a vacation years ago, a cryptic message to a friend, a saved article on a topic that once fascinated me. Each deletion was a small death. I was witnessing my own life being redacted in real time, reduced to a series of 404 errors and account not found messages. The man who had these interests, these friends, these memories, was ceasing to exist. The system they built thrives on data, and I was starving them of their prize, becoming a void where a person used to be. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the grimy windows of the cafe, I made my final move. I accessed a deep web escrow account I had established years prior, a contingency fund for a day I hoped would never come. It contained a small cache of cryptocurrency, untraceable and anonymous. With a few clicks, I transferred the funds to a new sterile wallet, severing the last financial tie to my old life. The screen confirmed the transaction. It was done. I logged off, wiped the terminal's local memory, and walked out into the cold morning air. I was digitally sterile, a blank file in a world built on information. The feeling was not one of freedom, but of profound and terrifying isolation. With no identity and only a handful of cash, public transport was a risk. Terminals meant cameras. Ticket purchases meant data trails. So I walked. I walked until the city's concrete sprawl gave way to the cracked asphalt of forgotten highways. My destination was a vague point on a mental map, a remote sanctuary far to the north. But the journey there would have to be improvised, stitched together from moments of opportunity and luck. The first leg of that journey began on the shoulder of a desolate road, my thumb outstretched, a silent plea to the few passing vehicles. I was no longer an operative. I was a vagrant, another piece of roadside debris hoping for a moment of human kindness. The cars and trucks that passed were few and far between. Most drivers would glance at me, their faces a mixture of suspicion and pity, before accelerating away. I couldn't blame them. I was a specter on the roadside, a hooded figure with a haunted look in his eyes, offering no destination but a way. Each rejection was a small sting, a reminder of my new status as an outsider. I learned to read the vehicles, the drivers. A family car was a lost cause. A company truck was too professional. I waited for the loners, the outcasts, the ones who drove beaten-down vehicles and had the same weary look in their eyes that I felt in my soul. They were the ones who might understand. Eventually, a sputtering, rust-eaten pickup truck slowed and pulled over. The driver was an old man with a face like a road map of hard times, his eyes cloudy, but not unkind. He didn't ask many questions, and I offered no answers. The cab smelled of oil and wet earth. We drove in a comfortable silence, the hum of the engine a welcome reprieve from the paranoid thoughts swirling in my head. I watched the landscape change through the dirt-streaked window, the urban decay slowly replaced by sparse fields and skeletal trees dusted with the first signs of snow. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something other than raw fear. It was a fragile, fleeting sense of forward motion. This became the pattern of my life. I would ride with a stranger for 100 miles, then be dropped at a desolate intersection to start the process all over again. Each ride was a calculated risk, a roll of the dice. I slept in abandoned barns under bridges in the dense woods that lined the highways. I ate what I could buy with cash from lonely gas stations, or when I had to, what I could steal. I was living a primal existence, guided only by the need to keep moving, to stay off the grid, to put as much distance as possible between myself and the hunters. I was a ghost hitchhiking my way across a frozen landscape, invisible to the world I had left behind. The journey north wasn't a straight line. It was a jagged, unpredictable path through the forgotten arteries of the country. I avoided major highways. I avoided population centers. I navigated through dying industrial towns. I navigated through decaying rural communities. These places were the skeletal remains of a bygone era, landscapes of rust and ruin. Abandoned factories stood like hollowed-out cathedrals. Their windows were shattered like vacant eyes staring out at empty streets. These were places the modern world had left behind, and in their decay I found a strange kind of sanctuary. They were blind spots on the digital map. Surveillance sparse, life slower, more analog. I moved through these concrete wildernesses like a scavenger. The skills I had learned for asymmetric warfare, foreign deserts, jungles. I learned to read the landscape for shelter and resources. An old warehouse could provide a roof for the night. Its cavernous, echoing interior became a shield from the biting wind. A defunct rail yard offered a maze of rusted boxcars to hide in. A perfect labyrinth to disappear within if I sensed I was being followed. I became an expert in trespassing, moving unseen through the periphery, sticking to the shadows and overgrown alleyways. The quiet gave my thoughts too much room to roam. Faces of my dead comrades would surface unbidden. The face of my wife would surface unbidden. Paranoia became my constant companion. A car driving too slowly, a light flicking on in a distant window. Everything a potential threat. I was a soldier fighting a war in my own mind, seeing enemies in every shadow of the desolate urban landscape I now called home. But these places also offered a unique form of camouflage, in a world of ubiquitous tracking and facial recognition. The best place to hide is not in the wilderness, but in a place of widespread neglect. No one was looking for a high-value target in a town where the primary industry was poverty and the main export was hopelessness. I was just another ghost haunting the ruins, my face obscured by a layer of grime and a burgeoning beard, my movements lost in the general decay. I was using their own system's blind spots against them, hiding in the cracks of the world they were so desperate to control. My greatest fear was not the men on the ground. It was the eyes in the sky. I knew their capabilities intimately. High-altitude drones with thermal imaging that could spot a rabbit from 10,000 feet. Satellite surveillance that could read a license plate from orbit. They had a god's-eye view of the world. A network of persistent, unblinking watchers that never slept. Every open field, every long, straight stretch of road was a kill zone, a place where I was completely exposed. My paranoia was a constant, neck-prickling sensation, a feeling of being watched that was more than just a feeling. It was a certainty. This fear dictated my every move. I learned to think in terms of overhead cover. I moved at dawn and dusk, when the long shadows could obscure my form and the changing light could confuse their sensors. During the day, I would hole up, finding shelter under dense tree canopies, in deep culverts beneath the roads, within the skeletal remains of buildings. I became nocturnal, a creature of the twilight hours. I would scan the skies constantly, my eyes searching for the telltale glint of a lens, or the unnatural silhouette of a drone against the clouds. The distant, high-pitched whine of an engine would send me scrambling for cover, my heart pounding in my chest. I saw them a few times, or at least I thought I did. A black speck moving in a perfect, unnaturally straight line across the vast, empty sky. Were they looking for me specifically, or was it just routine surveillance of a potential transit corridor? I couldn't know, and that uncertainty was a form of psychological torture. They didn't need to find me to control me. They just needed me to know that they could be anywhere, at any time. The sky, which once represented freedom, had become the ceiling of my prison. This constant threat from above forced me to change my entire way of thinking about movement. I couldn't just think about the path ahead. I had to visualize it from 5 miles up. A dense forest was not just a collection of trees. It was a patch of green that broke up my thermal signature. A river was not just an obstacle. It was a cold path that could mask my heat trail. I was playing a 3-dimensional chess match against an invisible opponent. Every move a gamble, the price of a mistake absolute. The world had become a hostile, alien landscape, and I was an intruder trying to navigate it without being seen by its ever-watchful gods. After weeks of travel, I finally saw it. Nestled deep in a valley, miles from the nearest paved road, was a thin column of smoke rising into the crisp winter air. It was a beacon, a prearranged signal. The cabin was exactly as it had been described to me in encrypted messages years ago. a relic of a conversation about a final contingency that had seemed purely theoretical at the time. It was small, made of dark, weathered logs, almost completely swallowed by the snow and the surrounding forest. It looked less like a dwelling and more like a natural feature of the landscape, a place designed to be overlooked. My approach was slow and cautious. This was the most dangerous moment. A trap could be laid anywhere. I spent hours observing the cabin from a high ridge, my breath misting in the frigid air. I watched the patterns of the smoke from the chimney. I looked for any sign of movement, any tracks in the snow that didn't belong. My training screamed at me to expect an ambush, to see this sanctuary as the final perfect snare. My trust had been so thoroughly shattered that even the prospect of safety felt like a threat. I was a wild animal approaching a waterhole, acutely aware that predators could be lurking just out of sight. Finally, convinced the site was clear, I made my way down into the valley. Each step in the deep snow was a deafening crunch in the profound silence of the woods. As I drew closer, the scent of wood smoke grew stronger, mingling with the smell of brewing coffee. It was a smell of domesticity, of normalcy, that was so alien to me now that it felt like a punch to the gut. I reached the small, snow-dusted porch and hesitated. My hand, raw and chapped from the cold, hovered over the rough-hewn wooden door. This was it, the end of the run, a threshold between the life of a hunted ghost and whatever came next. I knocked. 3 sharp raps, a pause, then 2 more.
You're late. I was starting to think they'd finally gotten you.
The door swung open, and I stepped out of the wilderness and into the dim, flickering light of the cabin. The man who opened the door was named Kale. At least, that was the name I knew him by. Names were like coats. You changed them with the weather. He looked older than I remembered. The wilderness had a way of aging you. His face was thin, etched with stress. Sleepless nights showed in his eyes. A thick, untamed beard covered his jaw. His eyes were sharp, intelligent. They radiated a simmering distrust. He held a heavy-duty flashlight like a club. There was clearly a weapon within arm's reach. Kale was a digital phantom who had disconnected years ago. The cabin was primal living and high technology. A crackling fire in a stone hearth cast dancing shadows. The warmth began to thaw my frozen limbs. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, hot electronics. A chaotic nest of wires snaked across a rough wooden table. Laptops glowed. Hard drives sat stacked. A satellite uplink rig hummed. A bank of batteries powered it. A digital command center in a 19th century shell. Kale stepped back and watched me with unnerving intensity. I closed the heavy door behind me, shutting out the snowy forest. He scanned me. Ragged clothes, gaunt face, the crude healing wound on my neck. Not sympathy, clinical assessment. He calculated the odds, asset or liability. His silence was a test. "They almost had me," I said, my voice raspy. I looked toward the fire. They activated the kill switch. I touched the tender spot on my neck. That was all I needed to say. Kale's expression softened to grim understanding. He had warned me about the implants, a slave's collar. He had been right. He exhaled. Tension eased. He gestured to a worn armchair by the fire. The interrogation was over. The debriefing was about to begin. Kyle moved to the small makeshift kitchen area and poured 2 mugs of thick black coffee. He handed one to me without a word. My hands, still numb from the cold, trembled as I reached. I wrapped them around the warm ceramic, the heat a painful, welcome shock. We stood in silence for a few moments. The only sounds, the crackling of the fire and the low hum of his machines. This was our way. We had served together a lifetime ago, in a unit where silence communicated more than words ever could. We were 2 broken pieces from the same shattered past, and our reunion was not one of joy, but of a shared, grim purpose. Our alliance was born not of friendship, but of a common enemy.
You brought company.
To him, I wasn't an old comrade seeking refuge. I was a potential vector of infection, a homing pigeon that might lead an airstrike to his doorstep. He had built this sanctuary to be invisible, and my arrival had just painted a giant target on it. "I was clean," I replied, meeting his gaze. no electronics, no traceable currency. I came on foot for the last 100 miles. I spent 2 hours on the ridge watching this place before I came down. The only tracks leading here are mine. I laid out the facts of my journey, the litany of paranoid precautions I had taken. I needed him to believe me, not just for my own safety, but because without his help, I had nothing. I was a soldier without a weapon, a messenger without a voice. His trust was the only resource I had left. Kale listened, his expression unreadable. He walked over to one of his laptops, and his fingers danced across the keyboard, bringing up a series of satellite images and spectrum analysis charts.
The local RF chatter is quiet. No unusual airborne activity in this sector for the last 72 hours. For now. You look like hell, Elias. Drink your coffee.
After a long period of silence, I knew it was time. The fragile trust between us had been re-established, not through words, shared history, mutual desperation. I reached into the inner pocket of my torn jacket, the one place I had kept secure through all the miles and the cold nights. My fingers closed around a small, ruggedized flash drive. It was battered and scratched, but I had wrapped it in layers of waterproof material, protecting it like it was my own heart. In a way, it was. It was the reason for the hunt, the reason I was still alive, the reason I had come here. It was the only currency I had that Kale would value more than his own solitude. I placed the drive on the wooden table between us. It made a small, definitive click against the rough-hewn wood, a sound that seemed to absorb all the other noise in the cabin. The fire crackled, the machines hummed, but all our attention was focused on that tiny object. It looked so insignificant, so mundane, yet it contained the seeds of a global conspiracy. It was a copy of a sliver of Aether's deepest archives, Aether's darkest archives, a data packet I had managed to extract in the chaotic moments before my escape. It was my legacy, my confession, my weapon, all in one. "This is why they want me dead," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Kale stared at the drive. His eyes narrowed. He didn't reach for it immediately. He circled it like a bomb disposal expert examining a new and unfamiliar device. He knew what it represented. It was a key, but it was also a death warrant. I explained the process, the isolated network I used, the layers of encryption I had wrapped around the core data, the physical air gap I had maintained before copying it.
All right, let's see what you paid for with all this.
Plugging the drive directly into his main system was out of the question. Kyle was far too meticulous for such a reckless act. Instead, he began a complex, almost ritualistic process of digital quarantine. He pulled out an older, air-gapped laptop, a machine that had never been and would never be connected to the internet. This was his sandbox, a sterile environment to dissect the drive safely. He booted it from a separate disk with a custom read-only OS. It was the digital equivalent of handling a deadly virus in a Level 4 biohazard lab. He inserted the drive. A string of commands filled the terminal. He wasn't just opening the files, he was examining the very structure of the drive itself, searching for hidden partitions, searching for embedded trackers, searching for any malicious code that might be lurking beneath the surface. It was a language I only partially understood. Hexadecimal code. File allocation tables. I watched his fingers move with practiced, economical speed. His entire focus narrowed to the glowing screen. The fate of our next moves rested entirely on his expertise. Standard Aether encryption wrapper. Triple-layered AES protocol. "Nothing fancy, just brute force," he muttered. They were confident in their network security. Arrogant. He worked for hours, peeling back the layers of security one by one. Each layer required a different key, a different approach. It was a complex digital lock, and I had only provided him with the first few tumblers. The rest he had to figure out himself, using old access credentials. Brute force algorithms. An intuitive understanding of how his former colleagues' minds worked.
I'm in. You didn't just grab a file, Elias. You grabbed a piece of the index. You grabbed the goddamn map.
The map Kale spoke of wasn't geographic. It was a map of information. A directory of thousands of classified project files, connecting seemingly unrelated operations into a coherent, terrifying whole. On its own, the index was just a list of names. But with Kale's residual knowledge of Aether's internal systems, it became a Rosetta Stone. He began to cross-reference the file names with his own encrypted archives, stored on a separate, heavily fortified server. He was connecting the dots, drawing lines between the things he already suspected and the new evidence I had brought him. The first cracks of light were beginning to pierce the darkness. He pointed to a folder on the screen labeled Chimera VOps. Chimera, he explained, was their economic warfare division. Officially, they ran market simulations. Unofficially, they engineered crises. He typed a series of commands, and a list of sub-files appeared. They were dated. One file, dated 6 months before a major market crash in Southeast Asia, was titled Liquidity Stress Test, Target Bourse. Another, from a year before a crippling famine in South America, was named Agricultural Futures Saturation. Each file name was a clinical, sanitized euphemism for a man-made disaster that had affected millions of lives. The pieces started to fall into place with sickening speed. My mind raced back through the news reports I had half ignored over the years, the sudden currency devaluations, the inexplicable supply chain collapses, the regional conflicts that seemed to erupt out of nowhere. I had seen them as the chaotic, random churn of world events. Now, looking at this list, I saw a pattern. I saw a hidden hand guiding the chaos, creating instability for a purpose I couldn't yet fathom. The world wasn't just chaotic, it was being actively manipulated. Aether wasn't just a security contractor, they were architects of global misery. Kale brought up another file, this one labeled Project Nightingale. He paused before opening it. This one was always a ghost, he said. Rumors. Whispers. They said it was a public health initiative. He opened the file. It wasn't full of medical data. It was full of logistical plans, distribution models, and public sentiment analysis reports. It detailed the global response to a recent pandemic, but the documents weren't reactive. They were predictive. Dated months, even years before the outbreak, they outlined the crisis with eerie accuracy, modeling the exact social and political fallout that would occur. They hadn't just predicted the crisis, they had war-gamed it. They had a playbook for it. It was like they'd written the script before the actors ever showed up. The pattern was diabolical. First, Aether would create a problem: poverty, famine, disease, chaos. Then, in the ensuing desperation, they would present the solution. A solution that always came with strings attached. A solution that always furthered their control. It's Hegelian Dialectic 101, Kale spat, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and disgust. Problem, reaction, solution. They create the crisis, wait for the public to cry out for someone to save them, and then they offer up their own pre-packaged answer. He brought up another file, this one containing diagrams and technical specifications. It showed a microscopic neural device, far more advanced than the crude kill switch I had torn from my neck. The file detailed its capabilities, biometric monitoring, data transmission, and most chillingly, neuroregulatory feedback. It was a technology designed not just to monitor, but to influence. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. We found a rollout plan, dated for 2028. It was masked as a global public health initiative, a voluntary program to implant these new chips for health monitoring and personal security. The maps were horrifying. They targeted the very populations that had been destabilized by the engineered crises. Aether planned to offer their Elysium chip as the ultimate solution, a way to guarantee health, safety, and economic stability in a world they themselves had thrown into chaos. It was the largest, most insidious population control scheme in human history. They weren't just trying to run the world, they were trying to rewrite the human operating system. Yeah, it was that bad. As the custodians of this terrible truth, our focus had been entirely on the grand scale of Aether's plans. The global conspiracies, the engineered crises, the technological enslavement of millions. We had been staring at the vast, terrifying forest of Project Elysium. But Kale, in his methodical way, suggested we look at the individual trees. He argued that Aether's greatest weakness might not be in their grand strategy, but in the smaller, more personal crimes they had committed to protect it. He believed that a story of a single, tangible injustice could be more powerful than a complex conspiracy that was too large for most people to comprehend. He proposed we search the archives for files related to me. I was hesitant. The thought of deliberately diving back into my own past, a past I had tried so hard to burn away, felt like self-flagellation. I had accepted that the man I was, Elias Crow, was a lie built on a foundation of deception. I had no desire to revisit the details of that life, to see the missions and the commendations. It felt like walking willingly into a house of ghosts, each room filled with memories that were now tainted and corrupt. But Kyle was insistent. "They came after you for a reason, Elias," he argued. "You weren't just a random soldier. You were important. We need to find out why." He created a new search query, this time using my old Aether identification number and security clearance codes. It was a journey into my own digital history, a chronicle of my career as a loyal and decorated operative. The screen began to fill with familiar code names, mission reports I had written myself, after-action reviews, and performance evaluations. Each document was a breadcrumb from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Reading them now, the words felt like insults. They weren't praising my courage or my skill. They were praising my obedience, my effectiveness as a tool, my willingness to follow orders without asking the right questions. I had been their perfect soldier, their sharpened scalpel, precisely because I never once questioned the morality of the hand that wielded me. The personal cost of my service wasn't just the physical scars, it was the moral blindness I had mistaken for duty. As we delved deeper into my personnel archives, we came across the records of my old unit, Delta Team 7. The names of my comrades appeared on the screen, a roster of ghosts: Marcus, Eva, Ben. We had been a family, forged in the crucible of clandestine operations across the globe. We trusted each other with our lives, a bond I thought was absolute. Seeing their names now in this cold, digital format felt like a desecration of their memory. They were more than names on a list, the men and women I had fought alongside, bled with, mourned. The official record said Delta 7 was decommissioned after a covert operation in the Caucasus went disastrously wrong. The mission, codenamed Iron Whisper, was a catastrophic failure. We were ambushed, our position compromised with impossible precision. I was the sole survivor, a fact that haunted me for years. The official story blamed a local informant, an intelligence failure. I carried the guilt of being the only one to walk away. It defined my life and rebuilt my loyalty to Aether. But as Kale cross-referenced Iron Whisper with Elysium data, a new, horrifying narrative emerged. The ambush wasn't random. The file held communication logs from that day, logs I'd never seen. They showed Aether Command knew our position was compromised hours before the attack. They had real-time intelligence of enemy forces converging. They watched it happen. They listened to our frantic calls for extraction. And they did nothing. They held back air support. They denied our request to retreat. They let us be slaughtered. The reason was buried in a heavily encrypted addendum to the mission file. 2 weeks before the Caucasus operation, my team had raised questions. We had stumbled on financial irregularities during a previous mission, evidence suggesting our target was funded by an Aether subsidiary. We filed a preliminary report, flagging the anomaly and asking for clarification. The addendum was Aether's clarification. It was a termination order. Delta Team 7 had started pulling a thread that could unravel everything. The ambush wasn't a failure, it was a cleanup operation. My team hadn't been killed by the enemy. They had been executed by our own command. The revelation that Aether had murdered my team struck me with the force of a physical blow. The guilt I had carried for years, the survivor's guilt, was instantly replaced by a white-hot, blinding rage. They were silenced because they had gotten too close to the truth, because their integrity had made them a liability to the Elysium project. I felt a wave of nausea and had to turn away from the screen, my breath coming in ragged gasps. After a few minutes, the rage subsided, leaving behind a cold, hollow emptiness. Why me? I asked, the question directed more at the universe than at Kale. Why leave me alive? Kale, ever the analyst, turned back to the screen. They must have had a reason, he said grimly. Let's find it. He began to dig into the files immediately following the Iron Whisper incident. He pulled up my psychological evaluations, medical records, reassignment orders. We were looking for the logic behind their decision, the cold calculation that had spared my life while condemning the rest of my team. We found it in a heavily redacted memorandum, a document so sensitive that most of its text was blacked out. It was a debate between two high-level Aether executives, their names also redacted, about what to do with me. One argued for my immediate termination, calling me a compromised variable. The other argued for my retention, outlining a plan for psychological reconditioning. They saw my ability to endure pain not as a human strength, but as a valuable asset that could be exploited. They didn't spare me out of mercy. They spared me because they had another use for me. The redacted memorandum was a dead end, a wall of black ink that hid the final, crucial details of their plan for me. But Kale was relentless. He explained that in Aether's system, even redacted documents left a digital ghost. The redaction itself was a separate layer, an overlay on the original text. With the right administrative access codes he had acquired during his own time inside, it was sometimes possible to peel that layer back. Suddenly, Kale made a sharp, guttural sound. Got it, he breathed. The script had worked. On the screen, the black redaction bars flickered and vanished, revealing the original, unobscured text. The final decision to keep me alive was justified by a single cryptic sentence. His personal attachment provides a unique leverage point for future compliance. My blood ran cold. Personal attachment? I repeated, confused. I had no family. My parents were long gone. My life was the military, the agency. My team had been my only family, and they were dead. What attachment were they talking about? My eyes scanned down the document, searching for a name, an explanation. And then I saw it. In the margins, next to leverage point, a handwritten annotation was scanned into the file. A single name, a name that had no business in a classified Aether document. It was the name of my wife, Elena. The name Elena hit me with the force of a physical impact, knocking the wind from my lungs. It didn't make any sense. Elena was gone. She had died 2 years ago, long after the Caucasus incident, in what I was told was a tragic car accident while I was away on a mission. The idea that her name would appear here, in this context, in a document about my future compliance, was impossible. KL, run her name, I ordered, my voice a strained, choked whisper. Elena Crow. Run it through the system. A single result appeared on the screen. It was a file, sealed and classified at the highest possible level, a level even higher than the Elysium documents. The file was designated Asset Intercept. My mind reeled. Asset Intercept? Elena was a civilian. She was a librarian. She knew nothing of my work. It was the one part of my life that was real. That was mine. The file designation suggested she was not an innocent bystander, but somehow involved, a piece on the board. I can't get in, he said, frustrated. But I can access the file's authorization log. I can see who signed off on it. He brought up a new screen, a list of digital signatures, the chain of command that had authorized the creation and sealing of the Asset Intercept file. My eyes scanned the list of code names and ID numbers, looking for a familiar sign. And then I saw it. At the very bottom of the chain, the final authorizing signature, the one that validated the entire operation. It was a crisp, clear, digital rendering of a handwritten signature. A signature I knew better than my own face. A signature I saw every time I closed my eyes. It was my own. Elias Crow. I stared at my own signature on the screen, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. It was a perfect forgery, I thought at first. It had to be. I would never have signed anything that put her in harm's way. I had built a firewall between my two lives, a wall of lies and omissions designed specifically to protect her from the world I inhabited. It was the one honorable thing I believed I had ever done. "It's not a forgery, Elias," Kyle said softly, his voice heavy with a terrible certainty. He pointed to the timestamp and the authentication codes attached to the digital signature. "This is a level 1 biometric signature. It required your physical presence, palm print, retinal scan, a voice command. It was you. You were there. You signed this." The clinical finality of his words shattered my denial. I hadn't been tricked. I hadn't been framed. I had been there. I had pressed my hand to the scanner, looked into the retinal camera, and spoken the words that sealed her fate. The only problem was, I had absolutely no memory of it. Cal kept digging, pulling up my operational calendar and medical logs from the date of the signature. The pieces clicked into place with sickening precision. The signature was dated 3 days after my return from the Caucasus, while I was still in a secure Aether medical facility, supposedly recovering from my injuries and undergoing psychological debriefing. The medical logs showed I had been heavily sedated, administered a cocktail of drugs including powerful amnestic agents. They hadn't just reconditioned me, they had used me. They had brought me into a room, my mind clouded with grief and drugs, and had me authorize an operation against my own wife. The full diabolical genius of their plan was revealed. They had murdered my team and used my subsequent trauma and disorientation to make me an unwitting accomplice in the next stage of their plan. They had turned me into the instrument of my own damnation. I was the one who signed the order. I was the one who marked her as a target. The car accident, the story I had been fed, was a lie. Her death was an operation, an asset intercept, and I was the one who had authorized it. I was not just a victim of their conspiracy, I was the architect of my own ruin, the executioner of the only person I had ever truly loved. The final truth did not bring rage or grief. It brought a terrifying, profound calm. The disparate, shattered pieces of my life. The loyal soldier, the grieving husband, the sole survivor, the paranoid fugitive, all clicked into place, and the picture they formed was of a monster that Aether had painstakingly assembled over years of lies, manipulations, and betrayals. They had taken a good soldier and hollowed him out, filling the void with trauma and obedience. They had used his hand to kill his friends and then again to kill his wife. They had made me the perfect weapon, a tool that could be pointed at anything, even at its own heart, and it would obey. I looked down at my hands. These were the hands that had held her, the hands that had promised to protect her, and they were the hands that had, through a biometric scan, condemned her to death. The guilt was an ocean, and I was drowning in it, but, something else was rising to the surface, a cold, pure, and absolute purpose. The despair was gone, burned away by a clarity so intense it felt like a religious experience. They had taken everything from me, my team, my wife, my memories, my very identity. They had left nothing of Elias Crow behind, and in doing so, they had made a fatal error. A man with nothing to lose is a dangerous thing. But a man who has lost everything, who has discovered he was the instrument of his own loss, is something else entirely. He is a force of nature. He is a reckoning. All the pain, all the grief, all the paranoia, it all coalesced and hardened into a diamond point of resolve. My quest was no longer about exposing the truth or saving the world. Those were abstract concepts. My purpose was now brutally, beautifully simple. It was about vengeance. It was about dismantling the machine that had built me, piece by bloody piece. I stood up and walked to the shuttered window, pushing it open a crack. The cold night air hit my face, sharp and clean. In the distance, against the dark silhouette of the mountains, I saw it. A faint, blinking light. Then another. Helicopters. They were coming. Cale must have seen them on his monitors, because he was already moving, grabbing weapons, stuffing drives into a go bag. They had finally found us. They were coming to erase their mistake. But they weren't coming for Elias Crow, the broken soldier. They were coming for the monster they had made, and I was ready to show them exactly what their creation could do. The first rounds tore through the cabin walls, splintering wood and shattering the night stillness with their violent crack. Kale returned fire, a controlled burst toward the flickering muzzle flashes in the trees, buying me the precious seconds I needed.
Kale threw the go bag at my feet. "One of us has to get this out," he said, his voice low and urgent, barely audible over the roar of the helicopters. "The backups are uploaded, hidden, fragmented, useless without the key. The key is in that bag." In that moment, I understood his plan. This had never been about both of us escaping. It had only ever been about the data surviving. He was buying time. He was creating a diversion. "Don't be a fool, Elias. You're the story. You're the proof. A dead hacker is just a footnote, a dead whistleblower with your history, your signature on those documents. That's a narrative they can't control. You're the ghost in their machine. Your job is to haunt them. My job is to make sure you get the chance." I grabbed the bag, slinging it over my shoulder. I owed him more than just my life. I owed him a promise that his sacrifice would mean something, a promise that the truth we had uncovered would see the light of day. I gave him a single sharp nod. The promise was made.
I moved toward the back of the cabin, to a small hidden hatch in the floor that Kale had pointed out earlier, a last-ditch escape route leading to a narrow, hidden crawl space beneath the structure. As I slipped into the darkness beneath the floor, the sounds of the firefight above were muffled, surreal. I emerged from under the cabin on the far side, into the deep, shadowed forest, 100 yards from the main assault. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran, my feet sinking into the deep snow, my lungs burning in the frigid air. They tried to delete me. They failed. They tried to break me. They failed. They took my life, my love, and my honor, and they used them to forge me into a weapon. They thought that weapon was their own. They were wrong. Now I am a ghost in their system, a virus in their code, a story that cannot be erased. They are the architects of a new world, but I am the architect of their downfall. They are coming for me, but I am coming for them too. My name is Elias Crow, but that is not who I am. I am the monster they made. I am the price of their ambition. I am the reckoning.